Brad Pitt entered film history not as a star, but as a definition of victory, of irresistible allure, of the man Hollywood felt compelled to trust. From Tyler Durden in Fight Club, the figure willing to burn every rule just to exist, to Benjamin Button moving backward through time in an irreplaceable solitude, and finally, the calm yet chilling presence of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, each role carved deeper a dangerous illusion that Brad Pitt could never fall. Long before that name became a gold standard, there was only a young man leaving Missouri, driving west with almost nothing in his hands, wagering his entire life on a single belief that giving up was not an option. But victory never offered him refuge. It only stripped loss bare. 2 marriages collapsing under the judgmental gaze of the world, and children slowly slipping beyond his reach, and years swallowed by the quiet spiral of alcohol. And now, at 62, Brad Pitt faces the most brutal chapter of his life, where loneliness is no longer something to overcome, but a place he is forced to remain. If a single performance by Brad Pitt has ever moved you, subscribe to the channel and leave a heart as a gesture of tribute, because behind that symbol stands a man who sacrificed far too much to remain in the light. It is not the spotlight that creates an icon, but the wounds they learn to carry for a lifetime without ever giving them a voice. Long before the world attached Brad Pitt's name to confidence and cinematic power, there was a young soul learning how to stay silent in rooms where expectation always spoke louder than love. Born on December 18, 1963, in Shawnee, Oklahoma, and raised in Springfield, Missouri, he entered a world where virtue was measured by obedience and love was expressed through control. As the eldest child in a deeply Baptist household, he learned early that harmony mattered more than honesty. His father, William, ran a trucking company with an exacting sense of order, convinced that structure kept chaos away. His mother, Jane, offered warmth and care, but even her affection moved within invisible borders that were never discussed, only enforced. From the outside, it looked like stability. Inside, it felt like living in a room where the walls slowly learned how to close. Nothing was shouted, nothing was broken. But silence carried expectations, and faith, revered and absolute, left little room for feeling out loud. By the age of 6, Brad had already learned how to soften his presence, how to listen for tension before it spoke, how to replace questions with compliance. A smile became his earliest defense, not joy, but camouflage. As he grew older, that smile hardened into something practiced. By 1973, at the age of 10, he was the boy teachers praised and classmates admired. Athletic, charming, seemingly at ease wherever he stood. Yet home demanded a different performance. As the air there felt heavier, words fewer, emotions carefully rationed. The lesson was never announced, but it was unmistakable. Discomfort should be swallowed, doubt should stay hidden, and fear did not deserve a voice. Decades later, Brad would speak of those years with restraint, admitting he had learned to live behind a smile, carrying what he called a quiet weight of guilt and shame. The language was gentle, but the truth beneath it was not. There was no single trauma to point to, no dramatic wound to explain the ache, and that absence was the deepest cut. He was praised without being known, guided without being understood. In church pews, he sat perfectly still, counting breaths, afraid that curiosity might sound like rebellion. At school, he ran faster, laughed louder, performed belonging with precision. At night, alone in his bedroom, he stared at the ceiling, wondering why a life that looked so good could feel so constricting. The contradiction took root there. Visibility without intimacy, approval without safety. At a time when other boys chased noise and rebellion, Brad, just 13, was learning how to fold inward and survive in silence, monitoring his thoughts, censoring his instincts, afraid of what might happen if the truth escaped without permission. Looking back, he would later describe those years not as cruel, but as suffocating. A life with no side roads, where direction was fixed and deviation quietly discouraged. Yet confinement breeds hunger. Inside that narrow emotional space, something relentless began to grow. The need to leave, to breathe without asking, to exist without being watched. The acting became the unlikely escape, not because it allowed him to pretend, but because it gave him permission to feel openly while hiding in plain sight. From Missouri's measured calm to classrooms, stages, and eventually screens beyond its borders, he carried the same fracture with him, luminous at a distance, uneasy up close. It would become the recurring shape of his life, admired by millions, yet forever listening for a gentler voice that never quite came. His story does not begin with fame or downfall, but with something far more unsettling. A childhood that appeared whole, where nothing broke loudly enough to demand repair, and where the discipline of being good only revealed its consequences years later, when the spotlight burned brightest, and the silence he knew so well returned, patient, familiar, and devastatingly complete. Long before fame ever reached for him, Brad Pitt had already begun his retreat from Missouri, aware that staying meant something inside him would slowly be trained out of existence. In 1986, at just 22, he loaded his belongings into a car and pointed it west. This was not ambition in motion. It was flight, an instinctive response to a fear that had grown intimate, corrosive. The fear that remaining would mean a lifetime of becoming quieter, narrower, more easily erased. Long before Los Angeles carried any meaning, his earliest shelters were movie theaters in Springfield in the late 1970s. He sat alone in the back rows, sometimes enduring double features, not out of devotion to the films, but because darkness was the only place where he was not corrected, monitored, or diminished. Cinema was not escape. It was survival. On screen, his men failed without shame. Anger spoke without apology. Pain was acknowledged as real. Years later, he would refer to that pull carefully, saying he felt something larger than myself, a restrained confession that those images granted him what real life withheld, the right to feel without retreating. That need sharpened with time. By the time he entered the University of Missouri in 1982, studying journalism and advertising, the classrooms already felt airless, instructional closing in. He could finish the degree. He could not finish becoming smaller. Fear, once it passes a certain depth, stops negotiating and begins demanding change. At 23, with only 2 credits remaining, he made the choice that frightened him most. He left before the walls could finish closing. "I just felt it was waiting for me out there," he would later say. Words that sound measured now, but were forged in panic. He packed a battered Datsun with clothes, cassette tapes, and a desperation no diploma could dignify, and drove west with $325 and no margin for failure. Los Angeles did not reward belief. It measured endurance. Survival came through work meant to grind pride down to bone, chauffeuring strippers to bachelor parties, hauling refrigerators up narrow stairwells, suffocating inside a giant chicken suit outside El Pollo Loco, waving at strangers who never bothered to learn his name. Each job stripped something away, yet every dollar flowed into acting classes with Roy London. In those cramped rooms, a dangerous reversal took place. For the first time, uncertainty was not something to hide, it was something to shape. Not the boy trained to suppress learned that exposure could hold power, and that restraint, once broken, could command attention. When recognition finally arrived, it arrived wearing the very shape he had tried to outrun. Between 1987 and 1990, opportunity came in fragments too thin to trust. Brief appearances on Dallas, Growing Pains, 21 Jump Street, faces without gravity, visibility without voice. Rent was covered. Doubt remained intact. Then came 1991. 15 Minutes in Thelma and Louise detonated into obsession. Posters multiplied, headlines accelerated, an icon assembled overnight. The world embraced what it could project onto him. Brad felt the familiar pressure return. "I wasn't comfortable with that label," he would later admit. "That I wanted to be taken seriously." The irony was unforgiving. The role that unlocked Hollywood also sealed him inside an image. He had left Missouri to escape quiet erasure, endured humiliation and anonymity, only to find himself confined again, this time by admiration. To the public, he was luminous. To himself, unfinished. Fame did not answer the question that sent him west. It sharpened it. And that unresolved tension did not recede with success. It climbed alongside him, tightening with every ascent, shaping the man beneath the myth, long after the smile ceased to be a choice and hardened into expectation. Fame did not arrive gently for Brad Pitt. It came like a rising tide that illuminated everything while eroding him from within. In the early 1990s, when he was just past 30, the industry finally stopped calling him just a pretty face, but freedom did not follow the recognition. A River Runs Through revealed a quiet intelligence beneath the beauty, and by 1994, Legends of the Fall had elevated him into something mythic, wild, wounded, unforgettable. The world saw tragedy romanticized. Brad felt himself being reshaped by expectation. A year later, at 31, C7 cracked that image open, exposing a darker gravity, and by 1999, Fight Club detonated him into a cultural force no one could ignore. By 40, standing at the center of epics like Troy, he was no longer simply acting. He was defining masculinity for a generation, so commanding $20 to $30 million per film, carrying an image larger than any single role. The schedule never softened. 16-hour shoot days, months without home, one physically punishing role bleeding into the next. There were mornings he woke in hotel rooms, unsure of the city, his body already sore, his mind lagging behind, moving forward on habit alone. Somewhere inside that ascent, something thinned. The applause grew louder. The rooms grew quieter. "I didn't feel at home in my own skin," he later reflected, admitting he spent years running from myself, numbing the noise with alcohol. While magazines crowned him the sexiest man alive, nights collapsed into long silences no spotlight could penetrate. To the world, he looked untouchable. To himself, he felt unanchored, successful, admired, and slowly disappearing from his own life. As the years turned and the roar of fame lost its power, Brad began looking for a way to turn relentless pressure into something that could finally mean more. Alongside then-wife Jennifer Aniston, Brad founded Plan B Entertainment, not as a vanity project, but as an act of authorship. The company became one of Hollywood's most daring creative engines, producing films that confronted war, trauma, injustice, and human fragility. Stories that earned Academy Awards and reshaped what prestige cinema could be. Through producing, he reclaimed a sense of control. He was no longer just the image on the poster. He was helping decide which stories mattered. Yet even here, fulfillment refused to stay. The workload expanded in a different way. Scripts at dawn, edits at night, responsibility that never clocked out. Awards lined shelves, influence grew. But when the house went quiet, the same restlessness returned, unchanged. Achievement spoke loudly. the questions underneath remained. At 55, glory was no longer something that needed to be pursued. In 2019, it came looking for Brad Pitt beneath the brightest Oscar lights as he stood there holding the golden statue for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. The entire room rose to its feet. Cameras flashed without pause. History seemed, at last, complete. He smiled, the familiar practice smile the world had loved for decades. But later, when the tuxedo was folded away, when the final congratulations dissolved into darkness, nothing inside him shifted. No relief, no sense of arrival. Only a stillness he knew too well. The boy who once left Missouri to be seen had finally been seen by everyone. And that night, alone, meant he understood something quietly cruel. Applause can crown a man, but it cannot carry him once the room goes silent. His fortune could buy estates, art, security. His legacy could fill shelves of awards. Yet neither could reach the place that had always ached without language. This was the final, unspoken paradox of Brad Pitt's ascent. He did not fracture on the way up. He learned how to hold himself together under the weight of his own success. And in doing so, he discovered a truth no ovation ever warns you about. Admiration can lift a man to unimaginable heights, while still leaving him alone to bear himself when the lights finally go out. Fame has a way of turning private love into a public story, and sometimes the glare grows so harsh that it erases the very people standing inside it. By the end of the 1990s, Brad Pitt stood at the center of Hollywood's promise, while Jennifer Aniston carried the warmth of a nation that saw itself in her smile. When they found their way back to each other in 1998 through mutual friends, it felt inevitable rather than accidental, as though two lives shaped by attention had finally aligned in quiet defiance of it. Their earliest moments were unremarkable in the best way. Unwatched dinners, shared jokes, a rhythm that felt easy, humane, untouched by performance. In those days, love did not need witnesses to exist. In 1999, Brad proposed during a Sting concert, music swelling around them like an unplanned benediction, like a private promise wrapped in sound and shadow. By July 2000, the world was no longer observing, it was witnessing. In Malibu, before 200 guests gathered on a hilltop estate wrapped in 50,000 flowers, with ocean air drifting through gospel harmonies and fireworks, later tearing open the Pacific night, Jennifer walked toward Brad in a beaded gown, her smile steady, radiant, unguarded. It was not simply a wedding. It was a moment the culture crowned. On red carpets they moved as one, hands finding each other instinctively. In interviews they laughed without effort, as if joy required no explanation. Romance did not need invention, it lived in their gestures. For an audience exhausted by cynicism, they became proof that love could survive admiration, that something pure might still endure beneath the lights. But what admiration could not protect them from was the slow pressure of expectation once the doors closed. Inside their home, absence spoke louder than celebration. Jennifer dreamed of children, of rooms softened by lullabies instead of silence, of a future anchored beyond premieres and applause. She imagined a life where love expanded inward, not outward. Brad had once spoken of wanting a large family too, half in jest, half in hope. But as his career accelerated, time became something he kept losing rather than choosing. The imagined sounds never arrived. For Jennifer, the waiting became spectacle. Cameras reduced her body to speculation, headlines questioned her worth, and each false pregnancy rumor reopened the same wound, again and again. She would later admit how difficult those years were. Just how many tears lived behind a smile the world mistook for ease. Brad carried his own unrest, quieter but no less corrosive. At the height of his career, with scripts accumulating and fame pressing from every angle, the unresolved longing at home weighed heavily. He later spoke of feeling lost inside success, of sensing something essential slipping while everything else applauded. Conversations that once flowed began to stall. Silence learned to sit between them. Their love did not disappear, but under constant scrutiny, even love can strain beneath what it is expected to fulfill. By 2003, when Jennifer described Brad as a big love rather than the love of her life, the words sounded gentle, almost protective. Yet something essential had already shifted, quietly, irreversibly, like a door left open too long, letting warmth escape without either of them noticing when it happened. In January 2005, they announced their separation, and by October, the marriage was legally over, long before either of them had truly learned how to let it go. The separation reverberated far beyond their home, reshaping how millions saw both of them, but the real damage unfolded in private. Jennifer became the face of composure under loss, her restraint amplifying public empathy as she moved through empty rooms at night. The silence inside louder than the cameras waiting outside. She would later speak of grief without spectacle, of learning how to carry disappointment without letting it harden her. Brad absorbed the opposite transformation. Fairly or not, he became the figure people needed him to be, the one who walked away. In losing Jennifer, he lost more than a partner who had steadied him away from the noise. He lost the shelter of unconditional admiration, the version of himself that existed before disappointment followed him everywhere. Years later, he would speak with rare honesty about restlessness and mistakes, about how easily a life can unravel even at its highest point, about not knowing how to stay still when stillness was what love required. When they crossed paths again, shared smiles, fleeting warmth, the world leaned forward, imagining restoration, clinging to the idea that something so beautiful must be recoverable. But some love does not survive the weight of being watched. What remained was memory, the knowledge that they once held something rare and could not keep it. Their story did not end because it lacked success, but because success demanded too much. And the wedding fireworks that once lit the Pacific had long faded, leaving only echoes and a question that still lingers unanswered in the dark. What if the most difficult role Brad Pitt ever faced was not the legend the world admired, but the life he could not hold together when admiration became everything? And perhaps that is the cruelest truth of all, that love did not fail them. Fame simply asked it to survive in a place where nothing human ever truly does. What ended with Jennifer was not merely a marriage. It was the quiet implosion of the only place Brad Pitt had ever felt unarmored. When that bond broke, the structure holding his private self upright collapsed with it, leaving Hollywood's most admired man drifting without ballast, exposed to the cold weight of his own reflection. He moved through the world restless and porous, carrying a hunger that mistook intensity for healing and urgency for purpose. In that unguarded quiet, fate introduced not temptation, but ignition. A woman whose calm could still a room and whose inner unrest could reroute entire lives. Angelina Jolie did not enter his story as an affair. She arrived as combustion. Their meeting on the set of Mr. and Mrs. Smith in 2004 transformed what was designed as light entertainment into the epicenter of a cultural rupture. But to Brad, she embodied everything his life had been starving for. Unyielding where routine had dulled him, volatile where predictability had numbed him, expansive where safety had begun to feel like suffocation. He would later describe being with her as waking after years of emotional anesthesia, as if something long dormant had finally drawn breath again. Angelina, too, would admit that she never intended to cross that line, yet felt pulled into a connection she could neither contain nor deny. "We found joy together," she said, words that to them described not a decision but a force already in motion. To the outside world, it was scandal. To those inside it, it felt inexorable. Their happiness, just as it surfaced, had nowhere to hide. An ordinary moment on a beach in Kenya, Brad walking beside Angelina with Maddox, but her adopted son from before she ever met Pitt, was stripped of its privacy and instantly turned into the center of global controversy. Brangelina ceased to be two individuals and became a phenomenon, a glittering name heavy enough to warp every personal moment. When Angelina became pregnant, making their relationship public was not an act of defiance, but a quiet refusal to continue living in concealment. On May 27, 2006, she gave birth to their daughter Shiloh in Swakopmund, Namibia. The first photographs of Shiloh were sold not for display, but with a clear purpose. Millions of dollars were directed straight to charities serving children in Africa, an attempt to turn public curiosity into something that could still carry meaning. In 2007, Angelina brought Pax home from an orphanage in Ho Chi Minh City, a quiet, 3-year-old boy whose eyes carried a history no headline could fully tell. Brad formally adopted Pax the following year, completing fatherhood not through blood, but through choice and responsibility. Pax's presence gave the family a new emotional gravity. Love was no longer a cinematic idea, but a daily reality, demanding, irreversible. In 2008, at Cannes, Angelina confirmed she was pregnant, again, this time with twins. Knox and Vivian were born in France that July, entering a family already stretched by difference, attention, and expectation. The rights to the first images of the twins were jointly purchased by People and Hello for a record-breaking $14 million, the highest sum ever paid for celebrity photographs at the time. But once again, the entire amount was transferred to the Jolie Pitt Foundation, a quiet declaration that their children, though born under relentless lights, would be shielded from being defined by attention or commercial value. From the outside, it looked complete. A family stitched together from multiple continents, where adopted and biological children were cherished equally, where love appeared expansive enough to include the world. Inside, however, strain was accumulating quietly. Angelina's protectiveness sharpened with each child, especially those who had already known loss, until vigilance ceased to be instinct and became a survival mechanism. Brad, learning fatherhood step by step, experienced the pressure differently. The fear that constant presence demanded more than love, and that the requirement to always be there left no room for quiet disappearance. What once felt like purpose gradually became weight. And even in their brightest years, beneath the compassion and carefully framed images, something was tightening, a shared, unspoken awareness that the life they were building required endurance far beyond anything either of them had ever been taught how to carry. What began as devotion slowly transformed into exhaustion, not because love was absent, but because it was being asked to survive without rest. Some families do not break in moments of chaos. They fracture quietly, under the steady pressure of trying to hold everything together for too long. When they became engaged after 7 years together and married privately at Chateau Miraval in 2014, the vows were sincere, but they were not a beginning. Yet they were an attempt to hold together something already under strain. Fatigue had settled deep, differences had hardened, and wounds left untreated never truly healed. The family grew larger, yet each inner world became lonelier. The tragedy did not arrive in a single explosive moment. It accumulated quietly. Conversations shortened, Silence lengthened, and the weight of parenthood, careers, and constant scrutiny pressed down on two incompatible ways of loving, one seeking control as safety, the other withdrawing when confined. Love remained, but neither knew how to offer it without causing damage. Then came the flight in 2016, inside the closed aircraft cabin, with no room to retreat and nowhere for silence to hide. Everything that had long been avoided was forced into direct collision, and the space trembled softly with the rhythm of the engines. Time seemed suspended, and the children were right there, close enough that it was impossible to pretend they could not hear, could not feel. In that moment, Angelina looked at her children and felt a fear that was pure, stripped of anger or judgment, rising instead from the most primal instinct of a mother when she senses the boundaries of safety beginning to blur. She understood with painful clarity that staying no longer meant protection. Leaving, however cruel and irreversible, became the only way to preserve what was most fragile from further harm. For Brad, that confrontation could no longer be delayed. In the tight confines of that aircraft, he realized how far he had drifted through years of quiet avoidance. Then he understood too late that what was slipping from him was not merely a marriage, but his place within the emotional world of his own children. The divorce that followed was not the result of rage, but the end of rescue, the anguished admission that the family they had once imagined could no longer remain intact. The years that followed unfolded in legal exhaustion, custody disputes, and the slow erosion of shared dreams, as Miraval shifted from refuge to symbol of separation. When some of the children gradually dropped the name Pitt, it happened quietly, yet with devastating weight, not as rejection, but as the consequence of a fracture left too long without repair. She carried the pain of knowing she could not give her children a whole home. He lived with the loss of realizing too late what he had failed to protect. There were no villains and no victors, only two people who had loved deeply, lost more than they ever expected, and walked away bearing a truth few are willing to face: that love can be real, intentions sincere, and still not be enough to hold on to what matters most. By the end of 2022, when the noise had finally thinned out and Hollywood had begun to look away, something entered Brad Pitt's life, not through announcement or declaration, but through presence. Natural enough to need no explanation at all, because Inés or Ramon didn't arrive as a statement or a spectacle, but appeared quietly beside him in spaces where he was no longer required to perform, from private evenings after the Babylon red carpet had emptied, to a closed birthday gathering attended only by those who had truly remained, to a night at a Los Angeles concert hall where they sat next to each other with the ease of people already accustomed to one another's silence. And when the year drew to a close, they chose distance over display, leaving Hollywood behind to welcome the new year on the shores of Mexico, trading lights and lenses for the anonymity of the sea. And by Valentine's Day, there was no need for confirmation beyond a single unpublicized bouquet of roses sent without commentary, the quiet gesture of a man who had learned enough from loss to recognize when something felt safe enough to hold on to. When Inés de Ramon entered Brad Pitt's life, it was not as a dazzling new romance meant to rewrite headlines, but as a quiet presence arriving after the noise had finally died down. At a moment when love no longer looked like salvation, but like something fragile he was no longer certain he deserved. Because by then, Brad Pitt was no longer the golden man chasing passion or reinvention. He was a man carrying the accumulated weight of two marriages that had stripped him bare in different ways. One that ended with the collapse of a shared dream the world adored, and another that disintegrated under intensity, legal warfare, and the most painful loss of all: the distance that grew between a father and his children, leaving him older, quieter, and deeply aware that fame could not shield the heart from consequences. and Inez did not arrive to fix that. Nor did she arrive as a spectacle, because she came from a world built on precision, restraint, and craftsmanship, rather than applause. A woman shaped by a marriage of her own that ended without scandal, without bitterness, teaching her that some endings do not need an audience to be real. And it was perhaps this shared understanding of quiet endings that allowed their bond to form not through grand declarations, but through recognition, not through the relief of being seen without being examined, because Brad Pitt had already lived through love that demanded performance and devotion that turned into public reckoning, and by the time Inez stood beside him, he was no longer searching for a partner to complete him, only for someone who would not require him to become anyone else. And she, in turn, did not seek to step into a legend or claim a place beside a myth, but to stand next to a man who had finally accepted his own limits. Their connection unfolding slowly, almost cautiously, away from red carpets and statements, found instead in shared spaces that did not ask questions, in concerts, in quiet travel, in ordinary moments that once would have felt unbearably small to a man accustomed to cinematic love, yet now felt like refuge. And the true significance of their relationship revealed itself not in appearances, but in timing, because Inez stood beside Brad Pitt during a season when life was asking him to look backward more than forward, when grief returned through the loss of his mother, when age and solitude grew harder to ignore. And in those moments, she was not a headline but a steady presence, not a promise of forever, but a reassurance of now. And perhaps that is where the deepest healing lived, not in declarations of devotion, but in the absence of pressure, because after Jennifer Aniston, he learned that love could end even when it looked perfect. And after Angelina Jolie, he learned that love could transform into something devastatingly complex. So with Inez, there was no attempt to resurrect youth or repair the past, only an unspoken agreement to move carefully, honestly, without illusions. And if this chapter feels quieter than the ones before it, it is because it was written by two people who had already learned what love can take away, making their bond less about romance and more about coexistence, less about future promises and more about emotional safety. A chapter that does not seek a fairy tale ending, because at this stage of life, peace itself has become the rarest form of intimacy. And if this is healing, it is the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that simply allows two wounded people to remain standing without asking either of them to bleed again. He had endured the highs and lows of his career and the pain of two broken marriages, and only when the noise finally faded did he dare to slow down, to trust in love once more. But nothing could have prepared him for what came next. On August 5th, 2025, his mother, Jane Etta Pitt, the one person who had never walked away, passed away. There was no spectacle in the headlines, no roar from the news cycle. To the world, it was the gentle closing of a long life. To Brad, it was the sudden disappearance of the only place he had ever been allowed to collapse without consequence. This was not merely grief. It was the disappearance of the only relationship that had never demanded explanation, repair, or performance. She existed before the roles, before the marriages, before the children, before the cameras ever learned his face. She believed in the boy long before the world demanded the man. When he left Missouri in 1986, his aging Datsun rattling west with cassette tapes and a few $100s, she was the one who packed food and faith in equal measure. When he was broke, anonymous, and uncertain in Los Angeles, she wrote, not with urgency or advice, but with the quiet certainty that even if nothing worked out, he was still held somewhere. Across decades of ascent and unraveling, Jane remained the axis he returned to after every fracture. When fame bruised him, she softened it. When marriages collapsed, she did not dissect the ruins. She asked how he was sleeping, whether he was eating, whether he was still trying to stay afloat. After Jennifer, after Angelina, When the world moved on and left him to carry the wreckage alone, she was the voice that answered. And when he finally stood on the Oscar stage in 2019, holding his first acting award for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, it was not the room he searched, not the faces applauding, not the validation he had chased for decades. It was her. She sat beside him, calm and unassuming, and squeezed his hand with a familiarity no accolade could replace, whispering something small, private, and irrevocable. Words that landed deeper than applause ever could. "You did it, Bradley. You stayed with it." For the world, it was a career summit, a long overdue coronation. For him, it was the quiet fulfillment of a vow that had taken a lifetime, to become someone worthy of the faith that had preceded his fame. That moment mattered more than the statue. It meant that amid all the wreckage, at least one promise had not failed. Like his mother's passing came after he had learned how to endure pain, yet still too early for him to offer his mother the peace she had long waited for. He had not finished building a home sturdy enough, nor settled into a life that would allow her to let go without lingering worry. Only after she was gone did he fully grasp the fragile line between losses that merely fracture a life and those that lift its very foundation away. The modest house in Missouri, once filled with her voice on Sunday afternoons, suddenly felt hollow beyond naming. The Los Angeles home, flooded with light and space, lost its sense of inhabitation. Friends noticed him pausing quietly before old photographs, lingering where his mother's presence had once lived. Once, almost in a whisper, he said, "She was the only one who never left me." At this stage of his life, that Brad Pitt's story no longer reads like a ledger of triumphs, but a map of absences. A family no longer whole, relationships that could not remain, children no longer under one roof, and now the voice that had kept him standing. One by one, each fell away. What remains is not fame, not legacy, not applause, but silence, where only a son is left standing, exposed before the greatest emptiness of his life. Nowadays, at the age of 62, Brad Pitt stands in a phase of life defined not by headlines, but by consolidation, of wealth, of solitude, of hard-earned clarity, and of the quiet weight of everything he has survived. His current net worth is estimated at roughly $400 million, a figure that places him among the most financially secure actors of his generation, yet one that tells only part of the story. This fortune was not built on volume, but on patience. Long-term back-end deals, negotiated at moments of peak leverage, producer profits through Plan B entertainment that matured while trends faded, selective roles that traded exposure for equity, and investments allowed to compound while his personal life publicly fractured. Unlike flashier peers who burned bright and fast, Pitt's wealth is unusually stable, diversified, and insulated from volatility, reflecting a man who learned, sometimes painfully, that endurance, not acceleration, is what ultimately carries a life forward. Today, that financial foundation functions less as excess than as autonomy, granting him the rare ability to slow time, retreat from noise, and choose meaning over momentum. More than any public image, Brad Pitt's sense of control reveals itself in the places he chooses to live. His relationship with architecture has never been about display, but about refuge. His current primary residence is a Spanish-style estate in the Hollywood Hills, valued at around $12 million, a secluded compound of terraces, stone paths, and glass walls that invite light while shutting the world out. Inside, the spaces favor calm over spectacle, warm woods, restrained lines, and an openness without exposure, reflecting a man deliberately designing silence after years of noise. Beyond Los Angeles, his real estate history reads like an inner map. Coastal homes in Carmel Highlands facing the Pacific, mid-century modern properties in Los Feliz from an earlier creative hunger, and the former shared ownership of Chateau Miraval in France, once a symbol of unity and later of fracture. Even after extended legal battles, his remaining property holdings are estimated to exceed $100 million, not simply as assets, but as markers of where he searched for shelter, reinvention, and peace across different chapters of his life. Amid homes designed to withdraw from the world, Brad Pitt keeps for himself a different kind of movement. Vehicles chosen not to display excess, but to escape human noise. The etched Titanium series and stripped BMW bobbers and the Ducati Monster do not stand as symbols of speed or luxury, but as enclosed spaces where emotion holds no power. When he rides or drives, his world narrows to traction, balance, and response. Everything either works or it does not, leaving no room for memory or pain. These machines do not ask who he has been or what he has lost. They demand only presence, and in return offer a rare sense of control his private life once denied. Within steel that does not betray and engines that follow rules, he finds a safe solitude, choosing order over chaos, silence over promises, and structure over the forces that once broke him. In daily life, Pitt now moves with restraint and intention. He divides his time between his home, carefully chosen film sets, and quiet routines shared with his partner, jewelry executive Inez de Ramon, living largely outside the churn of constant media exposure. Physically, he remains notably fit for his age, maintaining a lean, disciplined appearance through consistent training, moderated nutrition, and the firm abandonment of habits that once eroded his health. He has spoken candidly about leaving alcohol behind, committing to therapy, and learning to care for his mental well-being with the same seriousness he once reserved for his craft. And his relationship with his 6 children remains deeply private and undeniably complex, defined more by absence than performance, but grounded in a conscious respect for their autonomy as they step into adulthood. Philanthropically, Pitt continues to support humanitarian causes, including housing initiatives and disaster relief, with cumulative contributions estimated in the tens of millions of dollars, even as he keeps such efforts deliberately understated. Professionally, he remains selective, yet influential, balancing acting with production on major projects such as F1, Heart of the Beast, and the upcoming continuation of the Cliff Booth character, proving that relevance, when earned honestly, doesn't decay with time. In the end, Brad Pitt's present life isn't a victory lap. It is a reckoning refined into balance. For his story today is no longer about accumulation, but about discernment. What he allows close, what he holds at a distance, and what he finally releases. Wealth gave him options, time gave him perspective, and loss gave him depth. If this chapter resonates with you, not as a portrait of luxury, but as a meditation on endurance, reinvention, and the long arc of becoming whole, share your reflections, your memories, or the moment in his journey that stayed with you the longest. Because beyond the fame, beyond the fortune, Brad Pitt's life now poses a quieter, far more enduring question. What do we keep when the noise fades, and who are we when no one is watching?